What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think of today's discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit down video. Also, make sure you hit the notification bell so you're always notified when we do a new show or drop a live video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into another very interesting organized crime topic. And mean is a word that definitely defies most gangsters. To be a high-level mobster, you have to have the ability to earn, but also hurt people. And in the end, you need to be mean. But we don't normally go over many of the more miserable mobsters, the men who really were not easy to be around, but were dealt with gloves because of the fact that they earned. Today, we're going to talk about one of the individuals that was regarded as one of the meanest, most miserable individuals ever associated with the mob. The story of Anthony Mirra, next on the sit down. Anthony Mirra was born July 18th, 1927, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Now, we're going to talk today about a sprawling tenement in Manhattan on the Lower East Side, something called Knickerbocker Village. Now, we have discussed Knickerbocker Village in other videos. In fact, one of our most viewed videos we've done is on Lefty Guns Ruggiero. You can see it here. We discuss Knickerbocker Village at depth in that video. Now, Knickerbocker Village was home to a lot of gangsters really in the early, really from the 40s on. If you look into the lives of people in the Bonanno family, like Lefty Guns, Al Walker Embarrassments, Tony Mirra, Nicky Glasses Marangello, they all came from Knickerbocker Village. Now, what I found interesting about Knickerbocker Village is that it had really been for years, even previously to when it would be built in the early 30s, it had always been a very rundown area of Manhattan. At one point in the 10s and 20s, when people came over from Europe, a lot of them would place themselves in the Lower East Side and in the area where Knickerbocker Village was. At one point, it was regarded as one of the biggest slums in Manhattan. Now, eventually, a real estate developer called Fred French would acquire the land and begin building the sprawling estate that it is today. Now, I know many people will say it's not a housing project, but it pretty much is regarded as one in the eyes of people in the way we think. Knickerbocker Village, again, though, would be a host to many mobsters. Now, Anthony Mirra would live at 10 Monroe Street. Now, there are tens of buildings in this estate. Now, he was connected to the mob from birth. His uncle, Al Walker Embarrassments, would become a mobster as well, and he would actually become a made member and eventual capo in the Bonanno crime family. Now, what is interesting about Alfred Embarrassments was it's actually been regarded that he would actually be made after his nephew, which we'll get into in just a second. As I said, Lefty Guns Ruggiero would grow up in that area as well. Now, during the mid to late 50s, Anthony Mirra would become very involved with narcotics. He would begin selling heroin and would actually become very close with a guy who he would ultimately become a member of his crew. He would run the streets with Michael Mickey Zaffarano. Now, Zaffarano came up in Little Italy. Now, Little Italy is a stone's throw away from the area that Knickerbocker Village was in, and a lot of members would consort together in other families. Now, during the late 50s into the early 60s, heroin was a major money grab for the Mafia, particularly the Lucchese, Bonanno crime families. The Lucchese's, even into the Genovese, with Vito Genovese, there were three families that were very involved with heroin, and they had a pipeline up into Montreal and into Canada through the Catroni crime family. Now, it must be made clear that Anthony Mirra was an extremely high-level heroin trafficker. Now, in the late 50s, Anthony Mirra would actually be involved in a $20 million heroin ring and get a 3.5 year prison sentence. While he was in prison, he would be indicted by the federal government, and that would lead to the convictions to people like Big John Ormento, William Billy Bats Benvena, Vito Genovese. Anthony Mirra was a big trafficker. In fact, we would learn this in a federal trial. According to a person called Edward Lawton Smith, who was a Canadian Connect, he was someone who had connections to the Catroni family. He was an associate of that group. He was essentially a liaison to the Mafia in America, and he would become a federal witness. He would state that Anthony Mirra, according to him, was a member of a group operating under Big John Ormento in the Midtown area of Manhattan. And Mirra was responsible for the physical handling of narcotics for this group. Now, Smith's testimony would also show that Mirra was regularly delivering narcotics from Carmine Galante to John Ormento, who Anthony Mirra described as his boss. So essentially, Mirra was working under Lucchese drug powerhouse Big John Ormento. Now, I'll do a video on Giovanni Ormento at some point. He, alongside Galante and Joe Beck di Palermo, were the biggest drug dealers in the history of the Mafia. It's that simple, along several others. But Mirra initially worked for John Ormento, but he had major ties as well to people like Carmine Galante, who he was regularly getting drugs off of, and other members of the Bonanno crime family. So in his early life, Mr. Mirra was connected to other members, not just Galante and the Bonannos. Now, we would also, during this trial, in which Tony Mirra would eventually get 20 years in prison for, we would also begin to see a very sadistic side to Anthony Mirra. And one of the things that can be regarded as Mirra is he was an unhinged person who had no real issue with flying off the handle at any point. Now, during the trial, according to a newspaper article from June of 1962, at one point during the trial, one of the prosecutors in the case, a person called John Bosner, began kind of asking Mirra about his time in prison for a previous conviction, in which Anthony Mirra would pick up a chair next to him and fling it at Rossner. Now, he was about 10 feet away, and the chair would fall about 5 feet short. Now, Mirra's co-defendants allegedly seemed pretty spooked by this. Now, he would be shackled to the chair eventually and be put in leg irons. He would eventually return to trial, according to the article, in which he was chewing gum and smirking towards spectators. He was then shackled to a witness chair and gagged with gauze. He would signal frantically, and the gag would be lifted enough for him to get rid of his chewing gum. So Mirra was a bit of a lunatic, and that would have been discussed pretty early in his life. This was when he was in his early 30s. So he always had a penchant for being a bit of a sadistic lunatic, and he flew off the handle many times. Now, as I said, in that case involving the heroin, he was already serving prison time. He would be added and hit with another 20 years. Anthony Mirra would eventually be released in 1974. Now, he would head back to the streets, and look, once a gangster, always a gangster. Keep in mind, he's still not a made member of the Mafia, but he's a big earner. He's making a lot of money in drugs. He's involved in extortion, gambling, other rackets. It was mentioned that he may have been involved in several murders by this point as well. He was a very capable guy. And as I said, and I say time and time again on our channel, to be one of those remembered figures in the Mafia, or eventually become made and rise in the family, you need to not only be someone that can hurt people, but an earner. Tony Mirra could do both. Now, ultimately for Anthony Mirra, the mid-70s were pretty good to him. In June of 1976, alongside a person called Frank Lupo, they would become made members of the Bonanno crime family. Now, little is known about the rest of the induction, but those are the two members that night that were made. Now, according to a confidential informant, in and around this time, there is some questions to the dates as to when exactly Mirra and other members of the family are made. According to my knowledge, and I always reference the great LCN blog spot, they're the best when it comes to ceremonies. They would state that Mirra was inducted in June of 76. They would also state that, interestingly enough, he'd be made several months before his uncle, a much older Alfred Emberado. So there is questions as to the exact dates of these, but we can regard that Mirra was likely made in either 76 or at worst late 76. So Mirra's a made man. Things are good. He would eventually be placed into the crew of his old friend, Michael Mickey Zaffarano. Now, Zaffarano by this point was making a ton of money in the porn industry. I did a video way back on Michael Zaffarano. One of the first videos I actually did that kind of took off on this channel was of Michael Zaffarano. Maybe we'll do something down the road on more about the porn industry with the mob. He'll probably be featured pretty heavily in that one. But although Mirra was made, he would make a relationship in 1977 that may have proven costly for him. Now, there are questions on what ultimately happened to Mirra and the why, but he would eventually, at a bar in lower Manhattan called the Holiday Bar, he would meet a young jewel thief called Donnie Brasco. Now, initially, Mirra, who didn't really like anyone, took a bit of a liking to Donnie. Uh, Donnie was someone who could make some money, and he was probably a good person to have under him, right? An associate's an important guy because he's always sending money up to you. So Mirra was making good money himself, but he realized, hey, eventually I have higher aspirations. This guy could be a good guy to keep around me. And this is the first known contact Donnie Brasco has with the Bonanno crime family. So Mirra kind of starts introducing him to people. The problem for Mirra was he was facing his own issues. By this point, he's still very involved with drug trafficking. Now, this is also where things get kind of murky to me with Anthony Mirra. Anthony Mirra would ultimately find out that he was going to be filed under an indictment. So he would flee. He would head out of New York City. And several months later, Anthony Mirra was arrested and would eventually get 8 years in prison. One thing we find interesting, though, about the timeline of Mr. Mirra is he almost immediately is put back on the streets, not very long later. And this has always been the belief that I've had, and I think a lot of people have had, and we would ultimately find out later. I believe around this time, Anthony Mirra became a CI. It's just my opinion. There's a lot of questions on he gets 8 years and really doesn't serve much time at all. Now, once he is released, he goes back to the streets. Now, he's, away for a bit. But what Donnie starts doing, Donnie Brasco starts connecting with other families, part of the family. Donnie Brasco becomes connected with a person called Lefty Guns, who we all know. That's a story we don't need to retell. Lefty Guns, Donnie Brasco. So Mirra makes a beef because he says, hey, wait, hold on a second. This guy was under me for a while. I had to go to jail. That should be my guy, not Donnie. Donnie should be with me, not Lefty. So Mirra realizes, hey, this guy's going to not be sending money to me anymore. I need to make a beef on this. Now, ultimately, they have sit-downs, and Mirra is told, pound sand, he's with Lefty. So Mirra just kind of accepts it. That is what it is. But I think he was always pretty irritated with that fact. Now, Mirra would still go back to doing what he does best, making money. The problem for Mirra was twofold. The family was having a lot of problems by this point. We'll get into that in a second. For Mirra, he began kind of working closely with Sicilian Zip, Caesar Bonaventure. They were involved in all sorts of businesses, including vending and pinball machines, as well as strong arm extortion. Remember, video poker is not a big thing back then. Back then, it was pinball, vending, and Mirra really cornered the market in lower Manhattan with that. He was also regularly doing strong arm extortion schemes in restaurants, clubs, luncheonettes, all sorts of things. And he was getting a pretty penny back from extortion rackets. I want to talk, though, a little bit about as well his allegiances in the family by this point. In 1979, as we know, Carmine Galanti is killed, and kind of a power struggle ensues in the Bonanno family. We all know the story. It's the one group headed by the three capos, Sonny Red and Delicato, Philip Lucky Giancone, and Dominic Trinchera. They're kind of opposite of the Joey Messino, Phil Rastelli group. Now, initially, Anthony Mirra, due to the fact that he was very close to Galanti at one point, he slots in with the three capos. But from what is been made public, he would quickly abandon them, though. And several days before the plot happens that kills the three capos, Mirra makes it public that he has switched alliances and is now with the Messino Rastelli crew. Now, I think that's pretty normal back then because a lot of people just slotted and said, all right, we're in, regardless of our issues. We don't want to be the next person killed. So Mirra's now with the Messino crew, and he believes that that's his ticket to advancement. Now, I want to talk about kind of the basis of this video. Now, obviously, Mirra is an interesting guy, but one of the things that makes him truly memorable, really in mob circles, was his miserable disposition and, according to Joe Pistone, Donnie Brasco, his, quote, irrational behavior. Now, we would find out that Mirra was a bit of a miserable guy, like a guy no one wanted to be around. And according to Pistone, he would say that Mirra was the nastiest and most intimidating man he had ever met during his time undercover. He would say that at one point you might ask Mirra, quote, how's your mother, Tony? He might one day say, okay, but another day he might answer, what the fuck are you so nosy about? Now, it was also regarded that Mirra was a violent guy and was known to carry a knife all the time. And if you would ever get into an argument with him, you made sure you stayed an arm's length apart because he would have no problem just sticking you. Now, a lot of people believe that Mirra was just tolerated because he was a good money man. He made a lot of money for the family and people just kind of put up with his behavior. It was also known that he was very violent with women. He would physically abuse his mistresses and even also threaten to murder one when she confessed that she was a lesbian to him. Pistone would also say that he would insult everyone and was always in arguments. He was so loathed by mobsters that when Brasco was revealed to be an undercover agent, he quickly went into hiding because a lot of people knew Mirra was kind of behind it. But I also want to discuss that it is rumored that at one point, and look, this is a rumor, so take this how you want, but it is rumored that at one point Mirra had a somewhat romantic relationship with a young actress called Goldie Hawn. Now, this is a rumor, okay, and it's never been truly proven, but I don't know if it was a relationship. It was maybe just some sort of sexual relationship at one point. But Mirra was said to be okay with women, which that's pretty interesting. I also want to quickly discuss a story Joe Pistone would talk about in a book he had written about his time undercover. He would talk about a sickening escapade that he had with Mirra at one point that really kind of highlights the just miserable individual that Anthony Mirra was. Pistone would say at one point they were at a mall where Mirra basically said to him that he needed to use the telephone. Now, obviously, at that time, there's no cell phones, so they find a payphone. At the time they get to the payphone, there's a little woman, some young housewife that's using the phone. She's with her husband and kids. And Mirra basically says, hey, I need to use the phone. Now, within 10 seconds, she says, hey, I'll be done in a second. Now, Mirra would allegedly respond, quote, you've been on that fucking phone long enough. He would then say, I need to use the fucking phone. Get off the fucking phone, you fucking cunt. To which Pistone would respond, Tony, for Christ's sakes, leave the lady alone. You're embarrassing her husband and you're scaring her kids. To which Mirra responds, I don't give a fuck. I need to use the fucking phone. He then turns to the housewife and says, quote, now hang up the fucking phone, you bitch. Now, we've heard a lot of stories about gangsters who are pretty ornery. Some are, kind. I mean, they might be people that hand out gifts to people or try to open the door for a woman. Mirra was just an angry, miserable miserable. He didn't like anybody. Nobody liked to be around him. He had no respect for anyone. He was just a brood SOB. That's really all you can say about Anthony Mirra. Ultimately, though, for Mirra, he had major issues because, as we know, eventually Donnie Brasco was actually Agent Joe Pistone of the FBI, and multiple members of the Bonanno crime family found that out. As I said earlier, now Mirra realized he had a problem here. He quickly went into hiding. Now, by this point, Joey Messino is in control of the family, basically, and he needs to make this situation go away with Donnie Brasco. Now, certain members are dealt with. Maybe they're dealt with for other reasons. But Messino essentially says, Mirra got to go. Now, I will tell you the reason that I believe Mirra was killed. Now, a lot of people will listen to this and think that Mirra was killed because he was the first to introduce Donnie Brasco to the family. Now, that is believable. I'll get to that in a second. Mirra would go to the uncle of, Messino would go to the uncle of Mirra, Alfred Embarrassments, and his cousins, Richard Cantarella and Joseph D'Amico, both made members of the family by this point. Messino knew that the only people that could get Mirra to come back to New York and talk were his family. That's exactly what happened. In 1982, Mirra would be coaxed back into Manhattan for the guise of a meeting. They would meet at a lower Manhattan parking lot on February 18th, 1982. Now, Mirra believed he was meeting with his uncle and cousins, and that's exactly who went to kill him. As we know in the Mafia, friends and family kill you generally. That's how it goes. You don't have friends and family in the Mafia, and those are generally the people that end up killing you because they're the only ones that can get close to you. And that was the guys that these guys set up. Now, according to Joseph D'Amico, he would cooperate eventually. He would tell the story of how the hit went down to U.S. Attorney Greg Andres during trial down the road. He would say, quote, I got in the car. Mirra took out his key, put it in the box, but he didn't get a chance to turn the key in the box. I shot him at close range several times on the side of the head. Now, he would then say that he exited the car and went into a car driven by Alfred Embarrassments and his cousin Richard Cantarella, who were in a getaway car. They would then drive to the Hudson River and throw the gun into the Hudson River. They were then dropped off in the Lower East Side, and he would leave the jacket and gloves that he used behind. So that was that. Mirra would have to be killed, and he was. Now, I want to talk about, again, I talked earlier, I believe Mirra was at a CI. I think he was turned probably in and around the time he was arrested, 77. And that can be made clear because Joey Messino, when he cooperated in the early 2000s, he would state that Mirra was not killed because he introduced Donnie Brasco to the Bonanno crime family. Joey Messino would say in his trial when he cooperated that he, quote, flipped because he was showed a document by Alfred Embarrassments proving that Anthony Mirra was a DEA informant. Now, Messino and at the time, consigliere Stevie Canone would then approve the hit on him at that point. Now, also, it must be said, Richard Cantarella, who would also testify, would say, remember, he was on the hit team. He would say that he also believed that Mirra was killed due to the fact that he was an informant. So, while many people believe Anthony Mirra was killed because he connected Donnie Brasco to the family, a lot of people believe that it was more than just that. We have to go back to the time that Mirra was arrested in 1977 and ask ourselves, he was given 8 years. If he was killed in 1982 or even in 1980, which we know he was on the street, why wasn't he in prison at that time? 8 years in the feds at that time, you're going to do at least 4 or 5. I mean, being back on the street was very questionable, and I think that was probably around the time he flipped. We don't really ever know and never will, but I believe he was probably killed because he was an informant. At any rate, a pretty miserable guy who probably deserved the end that he got. In the end, though, he was a very good earner and a very big player in the drug business for the Bonanno crime family. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, make sure you hit that subscribe button before you go. And as always, we'll continue videos next week. We'll see you next time here on the Sit Down.